This is Paris. This is also Paris. Kinda. There was once a time where France built a second Paris, all in the art of war. Today's rather amazing story starts during the First World War, a city readied for war in the year 1917. With Germany on their doorstep, you'd hope that things couldn't get much worse. However, the advent of the Zeppelin had come, large balloons descending over Paris and dropping payloads of explosives on the populace below. So, where better to bomb than one of Western Europe's largest cities? That's right, London. Paris is what I meant. It's like second nature to say that right now. Speaking of London, they were getting absolutely pummeled to shit by bombs from Zeppelins. So the French took note and decided to do something about it. In order to protect their precious Paris, they took rather drastic steps in order to at least try and prevent the worst of the damage that might occur to both the city and the populace below. So, what did they do? Well, one guy had a pretty genius idea and decided that if they were going to bomb Paris and it was going to get bombed anyway, why not build a second Paris? Something which can get bombed, but isn't too much of a big loss if it does, because it's effectively a fake city. This is one of those ideas that sounds completely absurd. So absurd that it might just work. This Paris would not be a like-for-like creation, however, but just enough to fool the enemy into thinking that this was the real deal. This Paris, however, would be made out of wood and fabric, meaning that no actual infrastructure would be damaged, and that there would be minimised deaths also. Paris has many famous landmarks, so if you're flying overhead bombing people, just keep an eye out for the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower and you're pretty much there. You just need to make sure that your fake Paris, despite the fact that it's incredibly fake, looks as realistic as possible. If you were to try and pull off the same stunt today, you'd be pretty hard pressed because GPS is a thing, and you'd be screwed because if you built a fake Paris, everybody would know it's fake. However, back in the day in the First World War, GPS wasn't really a thing. So if you had something that could simply fool the eye of the German bombers up ahead, then hopefully they'll miss their mark, which was the entire point of this idea. The city planners instructed the services of an Italian engineer called Fernand Jacopozzi to architect the second Paris, and was focused around the construction of three main districts of Paris. The first of which was the northeast of the city, which would replicate the train hub. The second would be 11 miles to the northwest of the city, showing the bend in the river that runs through Paris, and it would be the reproduction of the city centre, complete with iconic monuments. With the third area being directly to the east, which would be the industrial zone with factories and other indications of wartime production. The perfect targets for those big old bombs, which would be perfect targets if this wasn't a completely fabricated factory. Basically, these fake munitions factories would put all their waste and tonnage on to basically try and make it as realistic as possible. These sham neighbourhoods would be the focal point of this master deception. This plan, whilst it sounded good on paper, did have a few drawbacks, particularly due to the fact that if you were going to make a fake Paris, it couldn't be too far away from the actual Paris, because even though you don't have GPS, I think most people would probably know the general direction of where Paris was and how far it is. So if you were going to make fake districts, it had to be still near Paris. So by doing this, whilst you could minimise the bombing in the actual city, it's not going to completely cut it all out. Imagine being the architect that designed and built the Eiffel Tower, one of the most iconic structures in the world. That being the fake one, of course, because the real one is already standing today, which must be a pretty tall feat in engineering. This whole thing had to be mapped out accordingly, not only making the structures, but also making these neighbourhoods appear real instead of just being basically chunks of wood. This required the use of glass skylights in buildings, translucent paint roofs, and even painting the entire neighbourhood to appear lived in. The coolest part, in my opinion, was the little wooden train that they used as an improvised track in an attempt to, well, make the enemy think that this was a real rail line they were bombing, which, of course, needed to be taken care of. This is all well and good, and during the day you can make these areas look as realistic as possible. In the night, it's a different story, because many of these bombers would be led by lights in order for them to find where Paris is before bombing. So, of course, measures are taken to try and light up these babies as light as possible to make them the prime targets over the rest of the actual city. Many bombing runs occurred in the night, so Zeppelins were guided by these lights down below in order to identify their targets. Many cities during the war regularly ordered blackouts to ensure that the enemy above couldn't easily see where to land. So, what was the answer here? We have a fake town in hopes that the Germans bomb that instead of anywhere else. You can't just light up the place like a Christmas tree, however, as that might be a little bit too obvious. They instead opted for a rather sneaky tactic where they pretended that people were being ordered to go in the dark, but there were a few points where fake lights were inserted, making it look like somebody had failed to completely hide the light in their house, making this an easy target for the enemy, which is exactly what they wanted to happen. The level of detail in some of these things was quite brilliant, as they even made fake chimney stacks and had smoke pummeling up through them to make it look like they were being lived in or being used as commercial premises. Either way, if they can make them look as realistic as possible, those would be targets and to stray bombs away from actual places in the city. As cool as this all sounds and as ambitious as this idea was, did it work and did it actually happen to begin with? Not quite. The war kind of ended before much of the fake city was even built, with only part of the construction actually being completed. By the time the war was over in 1918, the French government acted quickly to tear down the fake city, as this was not publicly acknowledged for many years. So it may have worked, but only time would have answered that question. Although we don't know for sure whether this idea would have worked, we know for a fact that it has been deployed successfully before, such as the British during World War II, where they made fake airfields for the Germans to bomb, only for it to be basically wooden planes and inflatable tanks. Other people who make fake cities are people like the North Koreans, that made an entirely fake and fictitious town on the edge of the border between South Korea, making it look like a utopia. But the reality is that this place is completely abandoned. These stories could be entire videos of their own, and they're incredibly interesting for their own reasons. A fake town could be used for a whole host of purposes, be it diversionary tactics or just straight up propaganda. Either way, it's an interesting concept nonetheless. If you guys like that video, here's another one just like it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.